Hey, and welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's great to be with you here today. I took a few weeks off, and I'm glad to be back here. If you've seen going around on the internet, Spotify Wrapped is a way to share kind of stats on what you've been listening to the last year. It's also a way for podcast producers to hear, what people have been doing. And I just wanted to share my thankfulness to you all who are listening. The Spotify Wrapped, who knows where they're getting these stats from? I'm always a little suspicious, but they were letting me know in kind of my summary for my podcast that I'm in the top 15% of podcasts that have been shared. Most people are sharing it over text. And so I just wanted to thank all of you who have been listening, whether you've been listening because you just love the content or you've been hate listening because you're trying to bring me down. Either way, thank you for listening. And it was just so encouraging to see that. I shared that with my wife. I was really surprised. I think we have a happy band of warriors here who listen and subscribe. And I didn't know so many people listening. So I'm really encouraged by that, motivated to keep going. Today on the show, we've also got a sponsor. We've got a returning sponsor. We've got goldriverco.com. You've heard me talk about them before. They do great tea products. They're also doing other products this Christmas season. And the reason I love goldrivertradingco.com is because they are unashamedly American. They love our country. They are a non-woke company. And so instead of going and spending your money with a woke company that's going to pay for all sorts of things you don't support, you can sign up with Gold River Trading, goldriverco.com. You can go there, and we've got a discount code. Discount code is theology. You can get 15% off. I wanted to highlight one of their products that is amazing. It's a hot cocoa with cinnamon spice. My wife knows this about me, that if she can, she will add cinnamon to everything because cinnamon is the way to my heart. I love cinnamon. And they have included all of this in their hot cocoa. So they've got cocoa, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. So this is perfect for winter up here in Colorado. It's already snowing quite a bit, and it's perfect for winter. My kids love it. And so they love this time of year when they get to drink that every day. My oldest is asking if he can have hot cocoa after school. And I'm like, no, that's not how this works. But if you want to head over to goldriverco.com, enter promo code theology to get 15% off your order, and that'll help keep you warm this Christmas season. Well, next week we've got on the show, Lord willing, Yoram Hazony. We're going to be talking about his book on conservatism. He's also written a book on nationalism. He is the leader of national conservatism and the Edmund Burke Foundation. We were actually supposed to have him on yesterday, but he was feeling a bit under the weather, and so we rescheduled for next week. So I thought, just kind of riffing off this morning, I wanted to address a good question I was asked on my Patreon. And you can ask any questions, give me some show prompts if you sign up on the Patreon. The link will be in the show notes here. In the question, I want to almost read it verbatim, okay? And this comes from a place where this person's asking, look, I understand that what the Bible says about men and women, and particularly in the church and the home. I get the biblical passages, I get the biblical arguments, but here's kind of the way the question is phrased. Why can't women be pastors? Why are women supposed to submit to their husbands? And why are men called to be leaders of churches and families? And so there was another kind of caveat here is that, look, we understand what the Bible says plainly. What is the Bible's logic in those ways? I think would be the best way to interpret this. Because I mean, personally, as someone who's fairly biblicist, even though you wouldn't perceive me to be that way, John Frame uses that word, and so I like to use that word. I'm a biblicist, so if the Bible says it, then it's a settled matter. That doesn't mean we can't have doubts, questions, concerns. We can't investigate further. Not at all. It just means, look, if the Bible says it, let's accept it as true and let's move on from there. But for a lot of people in our day and age, and for any age, they're going to have more questions about the implications, the why behind it, what is the Bible's kind of approach to this stuff. So what I thought might be helpful to explain it is to go, what is the logic the Bible is presuming to be true about the creational order, and why it deduces certain statements, declarative statements about men and women, and how the pastoral role should be filled by men, why wives are supposed to submit to their husbands, which my egalitarian friends always point out to me Right before that in Ephesians 5, it says we're all to submit to one another. But then, of course, it goes on to say wives are supposed to submit to their husbands. And so there's no way around that. But why? What is the logic? And so what I wanted to get into is a basic question of theological anthropology. I'm just going to go back to kind of like what I know and what I study. And the basic question of theological anthropology, there's two mainly. One, how are people composed? What are their faculties? Are we a soul body dualism? Are we a monism? Are we a tripartite picture of a human? Are we spirit, soul, and body? All these questions deal with theological anthropology, but it also deals with gender. And so the question becomes, with men and women, there are ways that we're similar and that we're both made in the image of God, but in what ways are men and women different? And this even plays out in a topic I've thought a lot about on sanctification, the desire to be more holy, to grow in holiness. There seem to be specific biblical commands, exhortations for men and women to grow in holiness in particular ways. Men and women should be sanctified according to their gender. That doesn't mean there's not transferable ways they should be sanctified. The fruit of the Spirit applies to both men and women, but there are particular ways they should be sanctified. And so the question becomes, are men and women different? And if so, in what ways? This was a question that came up all the time when I was at Denver Seminary, which is predominantly egalitarian. And they could never really answer this question. They wanted to trumpet and talk about how women can be pastors and preachers and all of this stuff. But when it came down to it, if you asked them, how are men and women different? The basic answer would be they're not that different. When the Christian feminist is faced with this, they're not that different. The only difference is really the sex organs on their bodies. Now, I've been making the argument for the last 2 years that this is precisely why the transgenderism or why transgender makes so much sense in our culture. It's because for most people, the church has gone way before the trans movement. The church went trans. The church decided that men and women, their roles in the home and their role in the church was interchangeable, that they could just be gender amorphous, that there weren't really differences. And so the church went transgender when they allowed women into the pulpit, and that set the stage for the cultural revolution, sexual revolution, and transgenderism to make sense to a lot of Christians. Now, I'm not, of course, blaming egalitarians for ushering in the sexual revolution, although there is an argument to be made for both of those things being tied to really deeper, sinister moves in our society from feminism. And I would encourage you to go watch Eve in Exile on Canon Plus. It's a really good kind of documentary. It's also a book. And it just recounts the 20th century and the different feminist waves and how they sought maybe good things, and others did not seek good things, but just how they impacted the church. But that's kind of a sidebar on the big topic for today. And so, for the Christian feminists, the basic difference between men and women is not anything rooted in hormones or God's design or biology other than sex organs. And so they may resort to cultural tropes about, different sex drives or different temperaments. But besides that, the Christian feminist basically says there is no difference that plays out functionally in the home, in the church, and other places. Now, you can get sideways on this stuff pretty easily. I will say that. Growing up in a more conservative climate, masculinity was often reduced to kind of cultural anecdotes. And so to be a man, you needed to like certain things, prefer certain things, do certain things. And so, where I was, it was a man loves a river runs through it, fly fishes, hunts, kind of the wild at heart paradigm of masculinity that you need to get out, and men were designed to explore and these kind of things. And, for me, I enjoy good combat sport, but at the same time, I also enjoy playing guitar and reading and reflection. I enjoy all sorts of things that wouldn't fit into that kind of brute force paradigm of masculinity. So this is a very interesting topic to me just to begin with. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. I've considered it a lot, my own sex, and in terms of how it plays out. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to lead? What does it mean to find a spouse? What does it mean to be a good husband? What does it mean to be a good father? All these things are deeply important to me. And they shape a lot of the research that I am doing because it deals with theological anthropology. So, what I want to do is kind of play it out in a few ways. One predominant way: why can't women be pastors, or why are women supposed to submit to their husbands, or why are men called to be leaders of churches and families? Um, and I think even broader than that, you can make the argument that why shouldn't women go into combat? Why shouldn't women go to the front lines? Because there are basic biological differences between the sexes, and I'm talking like basic between testosterone and estrogen. With testosterone, you get a different temperament when those levels increase. And with estrogen, you get a different temperament when those levels increase. This happens all the time for people, whether it's from breast cancer survivors, or other people, where their very personality takes on a different flavor when different hormones are produced in different capacities. And you even see this in the transgender movement, right? You see this where they acknowledge that the use of estrogen and testosterone can affect people's personalities and their desire to self-articulate their own gendered nature. And so testosterone, just that's a God designed reality for men. It's not something that most men are talking about, at least in the church. Instead, they typically just resort to cultural tropes, but testosterone is a big deal. There's a whole thing online where if you wanted to get into fertility rates and testosterone and all this kind of stuff, and what people eat and seed oils, it's a whole niche community online that you could get into. But what I'm trying to just focus on is the fact that testosterone produces a different temperament and a different set of skills and competencies for men than for women. And so they're not only just sex organs that are attached to men, but those sex organs have a reciprocal relationship with the basic biology of masculinity. And so men in general have a temperament that's more aggressive than women. Women in general have a certain temperament that is more nurturing than men. Does that mean that men cannot be nurturing? No. Paul himself describes himself as a nursing mother in one book of the Bible. And so this is not to discount the fact that men can be caring, all this kind of stuff. And it's not to say that women cannot be aggressive sometimes. If you are married, you probably know this. To a woman, you probably know this. So that kind of gets into the kind of like the framework of God's design for men and women and how they're different. And that's just one example, but it's a very important example. And so me providing one example shouldn't be discounted. It's a fundamental example. Why does that play out in the pastorate, and why does that play out in other ways? Well, Paul links it in the Bible to the creational order, that Adam was created first, then Eve from his side. And so there's a creational order there. There's a hierarchy there created in nature. Um, but it also gets into different laws of attraction. And so I want to kind of recap where I've been, and do a bit of a personal testimony based on an Aaron Wrenn article. Now, this article by Aaron Wrenn, on the laws of attraction, and I'm going to pull it up just so I can reference it accurately. It's newsletter 17, the basis of attraction. I had to stop listening to this multiple times because my jaw was just dropped. I was just floored by the content in this and how accurately it described my experience in the church. And so my experience in the church in terms of masculinity has been very poor. And the reason why is because we don't really understand the differences between attraction and how men are attracted to women and how women are attracted to men. And I want to specifically focus on men because that's where this hit home for me. And so what Aaron Wrenn goes through in this article is he goes through kind of the church's incorrect, what he calls here, the church's incorrect servant leader model of attraction. And so you'll get a lot of times he highlights Al Mohler, he highlights Matt Chandler, he highlights Dave and Ann Wilson, The Mystery of Intimacy and Marriage. And so a lot of these speakers, thinkers of the modern era reduce attraction to kind of a godly, holy servant leader model. And so, what that means, for example, Matt Chandler writing at John Piper's Desiring God says this: I keep saying it. Godliness is sexy to godly people. The culture tells us physical sexual attraction is first, then character, godliness, and compatibility follow. I think we get it backwards. I think once character, compatibility, and godliness are there, those fuel attraction in the way that pleases God and is much safer for our souls. Now, you may agree with that. I just think it's a specious argument that lacks any kind of credibility in reality. He's not using the Bible to use that. He's not even using basic biology to make that argument. It sounds appealing to many people because what Christian doesn't want to be godly? But basically, the idea is that the man is only to be the leader of the home in a servant leader capacity. And by servant leader, what we mean is that the servant leader is the one who serves the most and who leads through serving. It was actually really funny. We used one of these servant leader books at our church maybe 6 years ago to teach on leadership. And I think we had a revolt on our hands because many people were like, this isn't what you guys are. And I had just been so incubated in servant leader culture in Dallas and Texas and summer camps and Christian schooling that servant leadership was like, it's basically like the argument with winsomeness right now going on, and how winsomeness is a cultural strategy, and many people don't like hearing that. But it's not a biblical word. The idea with servant leader is similar in that many people have made servant leader out to be kind of this all-encompassing approach to how Jesus leads, to how God designed men to lead, all this kind of stuff. And Wren summarizes, he says, in summary, the church maintains that women are attracted to godly men of high character who will provide for, affirm, serve, emotionally support, listen to, and validate the high worth of their women. But is this right? Is this right? And, up until this point, I'm going, yeah, I've been taught that, and I have taught that, and I agree with it. And so Wren goes kind of on, and he goes, based just on how people are attracted to one another, none of that makes sense. None of that makes sense because there's certain things that drive attraction that aren't listed here that most Christians are very uncomfortable. And so he says the attraction is driven by four basic factors in priority order for women towards men. It's power and status, charisma and confidence, appearance, meaning looks and style, and then resources. Now, you will never hear this from a pulpit. You just won't, because these things all sound bad. These things all sound bad. What you hear in evangelicalism is power is anathema. Power just prima facie is wrong. You'll get charisma and confidence are arrogance. You'll get focusing on appearance is worldly. And you'll get focusing on other people's resources is greedy and love of money. And so you're not going to hear these things because the evangelical discourse on this matter has become so feminized on talking about these matters plainly. Now you can argue whether these things are true or not, but just looking around, you can kind of see this happening. You can see why the high school football quarterback gets the high school football or high school cheerleader, right? There are basic laws of attraction that you cannot get around. And so these aren't just surface things either. I think it would be easy to reduce these to like, well, this is just like looking at other people and judging them. Basically, Wren summarizes these for women in a long-term investment side of a formula, and men are going to make a long-term investment in their wives and children if they're godly, loving, reliable, have a strong sense of commitment, are conscientious, generous, and stable. And so this includes some of the servant leader characteristics, but not all of them. And so he has kind of a kind of chart on here that you can work through, and he contrasts this with the servant leader model. And so the servant leader model completely downplays the characteristics that are typically associated with attraction. So women are attracted to different things. Now, what does this all have to do? Going back to the main question, what does this all have to do? I'm trying to show and reveal and articulate how we've been so misled regarding the differences between men and women, not just biologically, but even in attraction, and then how that plays out. So, what Rin does is he categorizes them in a common kind of semantic binary that you'll hear. And I think it's a fair synopsis between the alpha characteristics and the beta characteristics. And that's just a common internet slang for describing the differences between a man who's more of a uh, man's man and a man who's not. Think of like a beta O'Rourke, which you can call him beta O'Rourke. Anyways, the servant leader model completely ignores or even downplays alpha characteristics. As a result, the servant leader model by itself generates zero attraction because godliness is not actually sexy. And he says, I cannot stress this enough. Godliness is not sexy. Um, and if you don't believe him, then you can look at Paul. Like, if godliness were sexy, then why did he have to warn Christians about marrying non Christians? It's the Christians that wanted to marry the non Christians. Paul realized that people could be powerfully attracted to the ungodly, so much so that warnings about it made it into the Bible. Godliness is a good quality. It's a good thing. It's something everyone should have and possess and pursue to grow more in godliness. But to make it the basis and reduce the attraction between men and women to simply godliness, um, and a husband doing spiritual things is not going to produce what a lot of men have been led to believe. Ren says it this way: the fact that a godly husband does spiritual things such as Bible studies and prayer every day will not automatically make his wife want to have sex with him. This is like, it's hilarious that that has been taught, but it is true that that is taught often. Another way I've heard it says is from a pulpit. I've heard taught a man teaching husbands, men, do you want to know the greatest turn on to your wife? If you would just do the dishes. I can tell you from experience, that's not a huge turn on. That doesn't lead to things that you think it's going to lead to. It may be a nice thing to do. It may be helpful in some ways, but maybe you're just worshiping your own sex drive and you're trying to manipulate your wife into having sex with you by doing something that she does, when in fact, that's not even like something that gets her going. And so I think for a lot of men, they are deeply confused on attraction and what it means to be a man. In fact, Matt Chandler himself, who teaches godliness is sexy, talks about in the mingling of souls, as Ren recounts, how he was constantly hit on by Christian girls because he was in a place of influence and power in a large Bible study he taught in college. And so they were attracted to him not because of his own uh, doing a Bible study. They were attracted to him because of his status as a leader, his charisma, good looks, his confidence. All these kind of things are attractive to women. Um, what does this have to do with kind of what I'm getting back to? Look, these things play out in all relationships. They play out in how men lead and women lead differently. And so not everything can be reduced to attraction, but attraction plays into how things are led and developed. This gets into kind of a common paradigm that Jordan Peterson has actually taught on. Um, and I think it's the Big Five personality test. And really, in Christian culture, the idea of being agreeable is one of the greatest things you can be. To be a nice guy, to be a good person. This is held up as a paradigm of what it means to be a Christian. And so this agreeable disagreeable paradigm is very important. And typically, just generally speaking, and I could say even biblically speaking, there's a way that women agree differently than men. And it's important in a church that men are the pastors, because you cannot have a bunch of people at the top of an organization who are high in agreeableness. If you have that, the organization will not thrive and it will compromise left and right. And that's why I think you're seeing it all over the place in churches in America, compromising on all sorts of things to stay agreeable to the culture. This gets into the problem of niceness in churches, and how it's really a pollutant more than it is a blessing. So all this kind of shapes a lot of the Bible's, to me, shapes the way a lot of the Bible understands why are women supposed to submit to their husbands? Because men and women are biologically different, and they have different temperaments and roles. And it's important for, according to God's word, that Adam came first. I think that the creational order is actually very unappreciated. James Jordan makes a good argument in an article over Theopolis, which I'll share in the show notes, called Liturgical Man, Liturgical Woman. And he argues that in the garden, the duty of Adam was to be the liturgical leader for his wife. And so these arguments aren't just rooted in some particular Bible verses in the New Testament, they're rooted in the very creational design of the world. That in a marriage, a man is to be the liturgical leader of the home. And by analogy, uh, according to the New Testament and other places, the church, being a home, being the family of God, should be led by men. And so this argument is that in the garden, Adam was responsible for being the head of the marriage and leading her, Eve, liturgically. And that's why, that's part of what makes the fall so tragic, is he abandoned his responsibility. You could speculate on what happened there in terms of what he passed on to Eve, what he was commanded by God, how he taught her, and how he failed to teach her in a particular manner, or how he allowed her to be misled, and it puts responsibility back on him. But we see in the garden, in the creational design itself, that Adam was made as a male, as a man, and that the man was expected to be the liturgical leader. And so, therefore, based on biology and his very word, women should submit to their own husbands, not to all husbands, based on not only just that's the way he designed it, but also because he said it in his word. And the same thing is true of God's church. And I would even expand it, and explore other avenues of what does it mean for men to be leaders in the culture? What does it mean that we have a culture where men and women are fighting on the front lines in the military? I don't think that's good, a good reflection for society. It's not reflective of a healthy society. Why? How can you say that, Chase? That's offensive. That's bigoted. No, it's not. It's just looking at basic biological differences between men's strength and women's strength. You're seeing this in every armed forces branch. You're seeing the reduction of qualifying characteristics to make it in order to accommodate towards the weaker gender, women who are not as strong as men, which I realize in our culture today sounds very bigoted and misogynistic. It's just not. It's just reality. You look at how the women's soccer team, the U.S. women's soccer team, lost to a bunch of high schoolers in Dallas. This is not offensive. And this wasn't offensive. And 20 years ago, this was normally accepted. And yet now we are supposed to live under the lie, the illusion that men and women are just interchangeable, and that anything a man can do, a woman could do too, which is exactly how we get to transgenderism. And I'm simply calling that not just into question. I'm saying that's a lie, and we need to stop believing that lie, because it's leading to a lot of pain for a lot of our neighbors, friends, and family. And it leads churches and families to compromise in ways that are not helpful and don't lead to human flourishing. So uh, I want to summarize by kind of going back to the Danvers Statement. It's a statement that I've referenced before on the podcast. The Danvers Statement was made in 1987 by the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. It was a response to Christian feminism, aka egalitarianism, in the church, the belief that women could be pastors. And so they released the Danvers Statement, and I think it was almost prescient, it was prophetic in its last point down at the bottom of the Danvers Statement, the affirmations. After they've kind of laid out the different arguments and convictions, the affirmations, they say this, point 10. We are convinced that a denial or neglect of these principles will lead to increasingly destructive consequences in our families, our churches, and the culture at large. And they're right. They were absolutely right in 1987. Now, whether I think that creating kind of a third way complementarian word between patriarchy and egalitarianism was actually conducive to fending off the Christian feminist movement, that's a different topic for another day. But at the very least, what's articulated in the Danvers Statement is very helpful, and might be helpful for you to review and study. And so I just wanted to highlight that at the end. Thanks for joining me today. If you have any questions for Yoram Hazoni, feel free to share them in the YouTube comments or sign up on Patreon and you can share them that way. And just a reminder, we've got a promo code theology with goldriverco.com. You can go sign up there for 15% off your order. Thanks so much for joining me today. See you next time.